By 8 in the morning, the first buyer had already arrived. By 9, there were 3 trucks parked beside the barn, engines idling, drivers stepping out to inspect crates of produce stacked higher than most of them had expected. What none of them knew, standing there in the early light with clipboards and cash boxes, was that less than a year earlier, most people in this county thought the farm behind them wasn't worth saving. Lena Ashworth stood at the edge of her own driveway that morning, watching it happen, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in almost a year. Not relief exactly, something closer to disbelief. Because 11 months earlier, this same gravel driveway had been empty except for a single rusted flatbed trailer nobody had bothered to move in years. And the fields behind it had been the kind of ground local farmers drove past and shook their heads at. If you've ever believed in something everyone else had already given up on, subscribe and stay with us. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Lena was 34 when she bought the place, a 41-acre parcel on the edge of Colby County that had cycled through 3 owners in 12 years, none of whom had lasted more than a couple of seasons before walking away. She wasn't a lifelong farmer. She'd grown up nearby, in a small town 20 minutes east, the daughter of a woman who'd kept a modest vegetable garden more out of necessity than passion. And Lena had spent her 20s working retail management before a series of layoffs left her reconsidering what she actually wanted her life to look like. The $4,000 she used to buy into that failing farm wasn't spare money. It was what remained of a small inheritance from her grandmother. The last of it, after 2 years of underemployment, had quietly eaten through the rest. It was supposed to be her emergency fund, the thing standing between her and real financial disaster, if her car broke down or she lost her apartment. Instead, she handed nearly all of it over as a down payment on land nobody else wanted, financing the rest through a seller who was, by his own admission, just glad to be rid of the place. If the farm failed, Lena understood clearly, she wasn't simply losing an investment, she was losing the only safety net she had left. The land itself explained a lot about why it had changed hands so many times. The soil across most of the property had gone hard and compacted from years of poor management. Heavy equipment run across wet ground, no cover cropping, nothing done to rebuild what had been steadily stripped out of it season after season. Drainage was a mess in the low southern section, where water pooled after every hard rain and simply sat there, drowning anything planted nearby. An old irrigation line ran through the property, but most of it had corroded or cracked years earlier, and nobody had bothered to map what still worked. Fencing sagged in long stretches along the eastern boundary. A grain bin near the barn had a hole rusted clean through one side. Weeds had taken over what used to be a modest orchard, choking out fruit trees that hadn't been pruned in what looked like a decade. Harold Whitfield, who farmed the adjoining 160 acres and had watched 3 previous owners come and go, wasn't shy about telling Lena what he thought when she introduced herself that first week. "You can put money into that place," he told her, leaning against his truck at the property line. "But you're fighting the ground itself at this point. Nobody's managed to make that soil worth farming in over a decade, and I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because I've watched it happen 3 times already." Harold wasn't wrong, not entirely. He'd farmed this county for 31 years, and his skepticism came from genuine experience rather than any desire to see Lena fail. He simply didn't believe the math worked. Rebuilding soil health took years, not months. Repairing infrastructure took money she clearly didn't have much of. And even if she managed both, there was still the question of whether anyone would buy what she eventually grew. Lena spent her first month doing something that surprised even her. She barely touched the fields at all. Instead, she walked the property daily with a notebook, the way she'd once walked store floors doing inventory counts, documenting everything she saw, where water pooled, where grass still grew thick despite the neglect, where the soil crumbled easily underfoot versus where it packed hard enough to resist a shovel. It was on one of those walks, in the second week, that she noticed something that didn't quite make sense. A narrow strip along the property's northern edge, maybe half an acre, looked different from everything around it. The grass there grew noticeably greener, thicker, even though nothing had been planted or tended there in years. The soil, when she pushed a trowel into it, gave way easily, dark and loose, rather than the pale, compacted clay that dominated most of the rest of the farm. Why was this one small section thriving when everything around it had been failing for a decade? She asked Harold about it, half expecting him to have an easy explanation. He didn't, not immediately. He walked the strip with her, crouched down, rubbed the soil between his fingers. "Huh," he said, which from Harold amounted to genuine surprise. "That's odd ground to be doing this well this long since anybody's touched it." It took Lena the better part of a month, working with a county extension agent named Priya Kaur, who'd agreed to walk the property and pull some basic soil samples, to understand what she was actually looking at. The strip sat over what had once been a natural drainage channel, mostly filled in and forgotten decades earlier, but still carrying enough subsurface moisture and organic sediment to keep that narrow band of soil healthier than the ground surrounding it. Whatever previous owner had graded the property, sometime in the distant past, had buried the channel without fully understanding what they were burying. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply 40 years of quietly accumulated organic material and consistent subsurface moisture that nobody had thought to notice or use. The strip alone couldn't save the farm. Half an acre wasn't enough to build a business on. But it gave Lena her first real piece of practical information. This land wasn't uniformly dead. Some of it was simply neglected in ways that could, with real effort, be corrected. She spent the rest of that first season testing rather than committing everything at once. She planted a small experimental plot of mixed vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, a few rows of greens. Using compost she made herself from farm waste and a modest cover cropping plan Priya had helped her design for the worst sections of compacted soil. She left most of the property untouched that year, unwilling to risk what little money she had on ground she didn't yet understand well enough to farm properly. The first real setback came in July, when a storm dumped nearly 5 inches of rain over 2 days, and the same drainage problems that had plagued the property for years flooded a third of her experimental plot. She lost most of her pepper plants and a significant portion of her greens, watching water sit stagnant in the low section for nearly a week before it finally drained. It was, by any measure, a discouraging blow. Lena remembers standing at the edge of that flooded section, calculating quietly in her head just how much of her remaining budget had gone into plants now rotting under standing water. But the flood taught her something specific rather than simply defeating her. Working again with Priya, she traced the actual path the water had taken, mapping where it pooled and where it eventually, slowly, found its way toward that same buried drainage channel she'd discovered earlier in the spring. The channel wasn't just feeding that one healthy strip of ground. It was, imperfectly and inefficiently, still trying to do the job it had originally been built for decades earlier, before it had been buried and forgotten. That fall, rather than trying to defeat the water, Lena worked with a small excavation contractor. A modest expense she negotiated carefully, paying only for the labor while doing what she could herself, to reopen and properly grade a section of that old channel, turning what had been an uncontrolled flooding problem into a functioning drainage system that redirected excess water away from her planting areas and toward a low corner of the property she had no intention of farming anyway. It wasn't a dramatic fix. It was practical, unglamorous engineering, built on nearly a century-old feature nobody else had bothered to understand. The second major setback came the following spring, just as Lena was preparing to plant her first real commercial crop across nearly 4 acres she'd spent the winter properly amending with compost and cover crop residue. A wholesale produce buyer she'd been in early conversation with, someone who'd expressed interest in sourcing tomatoes and peppers from local growers, backed out entirely, citing a new supply agreement with a larger operation 2 counties over that could guarantee volume Lena's small farm simply couldn't match. It was a genuine blow. She'd planned much of her season's cash flow around that relationship, but it forced a shift in her thinking that turned out to matter more than the lost contract itself. Lena realized, working through the numbers that spring, that she'd been chasing the wrong kind of buyer entirely. A large wholesale distributor wanted volume and price competitiveness, exactly the metrics a small, recovering farm like hers couldn't win on, not for years yet. What she actually had to offer was something different. Unusually flavorful produce grown in soil she'd spent a full year carefully rebuilding, harvested at genuine peak ripeness rather than picked early for shipping durability, available in smaller quantities but at a quality most larger operations couldn't easily replicate. She began, that same spring, reaching out directly to a handful of local restaurants instead, smaller establishments that valued exactly the qualities a big distributor didn't care about. The first to respond was a modest bistro in the county seat, run by a chef named Dana Reyes, who'd been sourcing most of her produce from a distributor 3 hours away, and had grown tired of vegetables that tasted, in her words, like they'd been picked a week before I got them. Dana's first order was small, a trial run of tomatoes and a mixed selection of greens, enough for maybe 2 weeks of specials. But when she tasted what Lena brought her, something shifted. "Where has this been grown?" Dana asked, tasting a slice of tomato raw off the cutting board. "This doesn't taste like anything I've been getting." It wasn't complicated. Soil that had been rebuilt with genuine organic matter, water managed properly instead of drowning half the crop, and produce picked at true ripeness rather than shipped green, all combined to produce a flavor difference that a careful chef could immediately taste, even if she couldn't have explained the agronomy behind it. Dana's order became a standing weekly arrangement by early summer, and Dana, the way word travels naturally in a smaller farming community, mentioned Lena's farm to another chef she knew at a restaurant across the county, who placed a trial order of his own that August. By that point, Lena understood something she hadn't fully grasped a year earlier. The goal was never simply to grow as much as possible. It was to grow something specific enough and consistent enough in quality that the right buyers would seek her out, rather than the other way around. She spent that second full season building real systems, rather than simply reacting season to season. A consistent harvest schedule tied to actual ripeness rather than convenience. Careful post-harvest handling to preserve quality during the short drive to her buyers. And detailed records tracking which sections of her gradually improving soil produced the best results, so she could expand deliberately rather than blindly. By her third season, word had moved beyond the 2 restaurants that first believed in her. A farmer's market organizer in a nearby town, hearing about her produce through a mutual contact, invited her to apply for a vendor space. A small local grocery, the kind that specifically marketed locally sourced produce to its customers, reached out directly after one of its buyers tasted a sample at that same farmer's market. By the start of her 4th season, Lena had more interest than she could immediately supply from her existing planted acreage. A genuinely different problem than the one she'd started with, and in its own way, just as demanding. She expanded carefully that spring, bringing another 3 acres into production, using the same soil rebuilding process that had worked on her original plot, resisting the temptation to overextend faster than her systems and her own labor could actually support. That is what led, in her 4th season, to the morning Harold Whitfield found himself standing at the edge of Lena's driveway again, watching 3 trucks load crates of produce while a 4th pulled in behind them. He walked over slowly, the way a man does when he's genuinely trying to reconcile what he's seeing with what he expected. "How did you do this?" he asked her, watching a buyer inspect a crate of tomatoes with obvious approval. "I told you this ground wasn't worth farming." Lena didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The ground wasn't the whole problem, she told him. It just needed someone to actually pay attention to what it was already trying to do, instead of fighting it. She explained briefly what she'd learned: the buried drainage channel, the soil rebuilt 1 season at a time, the shift away from chasing volume buyers toward finding the customers who genuinely valued what her farm could actually offer. Harold listened without interrupting, nodding slowly at parts of it, the particular quiet of a man revising a conclusion he'd held for years. By the end of that 4th season, Lena's farm wasn't generating extraordinary wealth, but it had become something genuinely different from what it had been. She'd paid down the remaining balance on her land financing 2 years ahead of the original schedule. She'd rebuilt a small emergency fund, not the exact $4,000 she'd started with, but enough to absorb a genuine setback without the same desperate stakes that had defined her first year. She'd repaired the worst of the farmhouse's structural issues, replaced the rusted grain bin, and hired a part-time helper during her busiest harvest weeks, someone from the same small town she'd grown up in. The trucks kept arriving that morning, the way they now did most weeks during the growing season. Buyers who'd once been strangers, now familiar faces stopping by to collect what they'd already come to depend on. Lena stood at the edge of that same driveway where she'd once stood alone with a notebook, tracing where the water pooled and where the grass grew a little too green for ground everyone else had already written off, and understood something she hadn't fully believed a year into the process, even as the early evidence had started accumulating in her favor. A failing farm isn't always a worthless one. Sometimes the problem was never really the land at all. It was simply that nobody had stayed long enough or paid close enough attention to understand what the ground was quietly capable of and who might actually be waiting to buy it once someone finally did.